What's up, everyone? Welcome to Bronze and Dragons. I'm your hostess, Adelina. Today we're having another episode of our deep dive series, this time taking a look at what happens when you die in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. This question, which has vexed philosophers for all of human history to this day, is apparently answered in Dungeons & Dragons, but it's kind of complicated. Before we begin, if you would like to support the channel, please take a look at our Patreon or like, subscribe, comment, and share. Without further ado, let's take a look at what happens when you die in D&D.
So many thanks to my adorable assistant Adelina for that lovely intro. And as always, I'd like to thank my boys in the Patreon, particularly Clyde and SK, who really took point on this particular episode. So thanks a lot, guys. So first, let's go over what exactly happens when a PC dies. The soul passes through the astral plane and ends up in the plane of its deity or its alignment. Revival is the process of reintegrating that soul back into the body. It's very important to note that when you die, all of your magic item attunements are lost, and you're going to require a short rest per item to reattune. So even if you get revivified in the middle of combat or something, you're not going to have your magic item attunements, and that can be a critical loss. Definitely something to keep in mind. Also note that the PC is now an object, no longer a creature. So it is unaffected by spells that affect creatures, for example, Cure Wounds. And that's not horrible, because do note that there are not that many spells in 5th edition that affect objects. It's only a small handful. And the PC does become a valid target for mending. So this can be very helpful if there's a decapitation or a maiming in place. But of course, talk to your DM. It's kind of a weird use of mending, so how it actually plays out at your table is going to be up to him. Now, dying means, of course, that your concentration spells are lost, but do note that your non-concentration spells are not lost. For example, Find Familiar, even the improved Familiar from Pact of the Chain, or Find Steed. But do note that some of these spell effects may be suppressed as we are no longer creatures, so therefore we may no longer be a valid target, for example with Mage Armor. Now the spells are still there, they are just suppressed, so they can return if the target is revivified before the spell ends. Also note that certain class and subclass abilities are also lost or temporarily ended. See the table on the right. Artificers will lose their infusions after an intelligence modifier number of days, minimum of 1. The Artificer Armor will lose its Arcane Armor, and the Battlesmith will lose its Steel Defender. The Creation Bard loses its Animating Performance. The Forge Cleric loses Blessing of the Forge, and the Twilight Cleric loses Twilight Sanctuary. Druids will lose their Wild Shapes, and Star Druids will lose their Starry Form, and Wildfire Druids will lose their Wildfire Spirit. The Cavalier will lose Unwavering Mark. The Astral Monk will lose its Astral Self, so arms, visage, body, and awakening of the Astral Self. The Oath of the Crown Paladin loses its Champion Challenge and its Exalted Champion abilities. The Beastmaster Ranger loses Primal Companion, and the Swarm Keeper loses Gathered Swarm. The Aberrant Mind Sorcerer loses its Telepathic Speech. The Divine Soul Sorcerer loses Otherworldly Wings, and the Shadow Sorcerer loses Umbral Form. The items created by a Warlock with Pact of the Blade, Talisman, or Tome all disappear. The Genie Warlock loses Bottled Respite and Sanctuary Vessel, and the Hexblade loses Hexblade's Curse, and finally the Scribe's Wizard loses Wizardly Quill and Manifest Mind. Now obviously once you die there are various ways to be revived, and note that when you are revived you actually gain a benefit when it comes to exhaustion. Being raised from the dead reduces a creature's exhaustion level by 1. So this can situationally make Revivify a better option than Greater Restoration if used solely to remove exhaustion levels, because it's a lower level to cast, and so obviously not so much of an investment from a resource management perspective. Although do note, Revivify actually has a more expensive component. You require 300 gold pieces worth of diamonds for that one, whereas Greater Restoration is only 100 gold pieces worth of diamond dust. But still, it's a nice way to remove exhaustion without having to blow a 5th level spell. And note that if you're a Zealot Barbarian that you can bypass the gold piece cost of removing exhaustion entirely. And finally note that the exhaustion gained by a Chronergist Wizard's Convergent Future is an exception. It specifically says that that exhaustion can only be removed by a long rest. So there are various ways in the game to actually revive the dead. One is through the Divine Intervention ability of 10th level clerics. This of course is dependent on DM discretion and the god, but it is possible. And 14th level genie locks do get limited wish, which can replicate Revivify or one of the other spells that can revive the dead. Speaking of spells, don't forget that we can do it in a kind of roundabout way by summoning a creature that has revival spells available, for example, Planar Ally or Conjure Celestial, or you could opt for higher level spells that turn a PC into a creature that has innate revival spells. Otherwise, we will use the spells that are in the game specifically to revive the dead, and I've put a little chart of those up on the screen. We can see that we have Revivify, which is the lowest level spell, available only at 3rd level. Note that you have to get to the body within 1 minute, and it does require the body. We get Raise Dead at 5th level, and with that one you have 10 days to get to the body, but again you do require the body, and it does impose a temporary penalty to your d20 rolls. Then there's Reincarnate, and that's an interesting one. You do have 10 days, and you only require a piece of the body, but the body is entirely replaced, your racial abilities change, you may lose any racial feats that you've taken. Reincarnate can have a severe impact on your character build. I suppose in some cases it can actually make you better, but I'm guessing in most cases it's not going to. So I've always been a little bit scared of Reincarnate. But that said, if I'm invested in a PC, I would absolutely take a Reincarnate instead of rolling a new character. At level 7, you can get Resurrection, and this is awesome. You have 100 years to get to the body. And while it does require the body, it will restore body parts, unlike the lower level ones, except Reincarnate. But note it has a similar penalty to Raise Dead on your d20 rolls. At 8th level, Clone is available, and this is awesome. Every wizard or character that has access to 8th level wizard spells should get Clone, in my opinion. It's so awesome to be immortal. At 9th level, there is the option for True Resurrection. And this one's expensive, man, 25,000 gold pieces. But you've got 200 years to get to the body. It will restore body parts. But note that, interestingly, and kind of opposite to the others, it will create a new body only if the old one is fully destroyed. So that can be interesting, as we'll talk about in a minute. And do note that True Resurrection will also lift curses. And then finally, we have Wish. Wish is the most effective of any of these options, but it comes with that huge penalty of having a 33% chance of losing the ability to cast Wish again, if we're not replicating a lower level resurrection spell. And that's a pretty hefty penalty. It can only be mitigated with another Wish, so kicking the can down the road. Definitely a last option sort of thing, but it is very effective if you can pull the trigger on that. I mean, it even counts if you're using like a Luck Blade or a Ring of 3 Wishes or something. Now, there are some hindrances to revival from death. First of all, the target must be willing to be revived. Now, note that Revivify is the only one that lacks this specific language about that, but it also doesn't provide an exception to the general rule found in the Dungeon Master's Guide, page 24, so it's still not going to work if you don't want to be revived. And the target soul does learn the name, alignment, and patron deity of the reviver prior to choosing whether they are willing or not, so that can be an issue. If the target's not willing, it's not happening. Another hindrance is that a lot of these spells require a body. Again, refer to the chart on the screen. If the body was destroyed by disintegration, being burned to ash, dissolved in acid, or whatever, there's going to be a problem and you're going to need like a True Resurrection or a Clone. There can also be an issue if you die from your hit point maximum being reduced to 0. Because remember, Greater Restoration only targets creatures and a dead body is not a creature. A dead body also can't take a long rest, which is basically the only way to remove that reduction, unless it was caused by a curse. Then if you're using True Resurrection, the curse will end, but still, it's really bad news if you die from a hit point maximum reduction to 0. Note that the target soul can be trapped or destroyed, or in some cases due to role-playing reasons it's just not there, for example, a warlock that has sold its soul for power. And note there's an item called Black Razor, a legendary greatsword that if you get killed by it, you're destroyed. Your soul is gone and you can't come back. Note also that Soul Cage, Magic Jar, and the Ring of Mind Shielding will prevent revival for their duration. The target soul might somehow get sent to the 9 hells through a DM contrivance and then get turned into a soul coin by Mammon, and then you're not coming back, which can be an interesting way for the DM to keep a PC or an important NPC from being revived. It can be a whole adventure in itself. Or the soul could end up on the plane of Carcery, which specifically requires a wish spell to recover from. This is from the optional prison plane rules from the Dungeon Master's Guide, so up to your DM, but be aware. Note that if the target soul moves into a clone, the original body can no longer be revived. Right? It's already merged into a new form. And do note that you can wait to enter the clone if you don't want to. For example, if you're expecting an incoming revivification or something. Also note that a creature killed by the Avatar of Death, which you get if you are playing with a deck of many things and draw the skull, you can't be restored to life. Luckily, the Avatar of Death is kind of a weak sister, but be aware, losing has severe consequences. Note that a creature killed by a Nightwalker can't be revived by any means short of a wish spell. The target may have died from old age, in which case only reincarnation, clone, and wish will work. And the target might not be dead. Specifically, a petrified creature is still technically alive, so you're going to have to get that taken care of before they can be revived. And finally, Undeath. Spells like Animate Dead and Create Undead, as well as Vampirism, do change a PC's body into an undead type of creature, and therefore disqualify it from some revival spells. Undead creatures are not affected by Raise Dead, Reincarnate, or Resurrection, and while they are affected by Revivify, it doesn't cure the undeath. You're just basically reanimated. To bypass these issues with Undeath, you are basically going to need a True Resurrection or a Wish spell to cure it, or a clone to entirely bypass the issue and just start fresh.
Well, that's it. That's our look at the effects and implications of death in 5th edition. Let us know what you think in the comments below, and thank you so much for watching. This has been Bill Bronze and Dragons. I'm your hostess Adelina, and we'll see you next time.